1944. The morning fog rolled across the French countryside, thick and heavy, pressing down on the makeshift U.S. Army K-9 unit camp like the hand of a worried mother. Trucks lined with canvas tarps groaned under the weight of supplies. Somewhere a radio crackled out Glenn Miller through the static. The men moved with a jittery energy, the kind that comes from too much coffee and not enough sleep. Over all of it, the faint, sharp bark of dogs cut through the air, constant as artillery thunder on the horizon. Private Jack Turner, fresh-faced and barely 19, stepped out of the back of a transport truck, boots hitting mud with a quiet squelch. His duffel bag thumped against his back. Every nerve felt raw. He glanced at the other men, older, more hardened, already dirty with days-old beards and silent eyes. No one said a word as he walked through the camp. He might as well have been invisible. He passed a fenced pen and stopped. Inside, a dozen German shepherds and Belgian Malinois paced restlessly, their eyes alert. One of them stood apart. Bigger than the rest, the dog watched him, still, focused, with a presence that radiated outwards. For a moment, Jack felt like the world had narrowed to just him and the dog, breath held between them. A gruff voice interrupted. "You Turner?" Sergeant George, the K-9 unit commander, stepped up, clipboard under one arm. He jerked his thumb at the big shepherd. "That's Samson. He's yours. Don't screw it up." Jack barely managed a nod. He'd never had a dog. He'd grown up in New Jersey. His family could barely afford to feed themselves, let alone a pet. The closest he'd come to a dog was helping his neighbor walk their old hound for a nickel a week. This was different. Samson approached. No tail wag, no bark. The dog's eyes, almost human in their seriousness, studied Jack as if weighing his worth. Jack crouched, hands out. Samson stopped a foot away, impassive, and sat down with soldierly precision. "Guess you're the boss," Jack muttered, half to himself. Samson didn't blink. Training started immediately. The next days blurred into a relentless rhythm. Sunrise drills, long patrols, explosive detection, hand signal commands barked by the sergeant. Jack stumbled. He mixed up signals, dropped Samson's leash, misread his cues. The other handlers, men who'd served in North Africa and Italy, shot him looks that said rookie without saying a word. But Samson never faltered. The dog responded to every command with cold perfection. Sit. Down. Stay. Seek. Every movement was crisp, mechanical, like the dog had a clock ticking inside him instead of a heart. Jack, awkward and hesitant, felt like he was trying to keep up with a machine that needed nothing from him. The only time he saw anything crack in Samson's armor was at night. While the other dogs curled up together for warmth, Samson sat apart, staring out into the dark beyond the camp. His ears twitched at every distant sound. Shellfire, footsteps, a scream that tore through the night and vanished as suddenly as it came. Jack would sometimes watch from his cot, blanket pulled up to his chin, wondering what Samson was looking for, or waiting for. On the third night, Jack had enough. He grabbed an extra blanket and walked over to the pen. The other dogs ignored him, but Samson's eyes followed every step. He knelt, feeling foolish. "Hey, Samson, you ever get scared out here?" The dog cocked his head, unreadable. Jack let the silence stretch. Somewhere an owl hooted. He draped the blanket over the wire. "It's cold, you know." Samson didn't move. The next morning, they were sent out on their first real patrol together. The squad moved single file through a forest pockmarked with old trenches and craters. Jack walked point, Samson leading by a taut leash. His hands trembled, not just from cold, but from something deeper. The trees pressed in, muffling every sound except their own footsteps and the occasional creak of distant branches. Halfway through the patrol, Samson stopped dead. Jack nearly tripped over him. The dog's body went stiff. Ears forward, nose to the ground, he blocked Jack's path with a sudden, deliberate sidestep. Jack hesitated, unsure. The rest of the squad whispered impatiently behind him. "What's wrong?" Jack whispered. Samson's gaze cut to the ground. The dog wouldn't move. Sergeant George pushed up beside him, grumbling, "Move it, Turner." But Jack trusted that instinct, something primal that Samson had communicated with no words. He pulled the leash, stepping to the side. Just as his foot passed the spot where Samson had blocked him, he caught a glint, barely visible under mud and moss, a landmine half exposed. One more step, and he would have been gone. The sergeant's face went white. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Jack looked at Samson, who met his gaze calm, as if to say, "That's my job." For the first time, Jack reached out and touched Samson's head, fingers sinking into the dog's thick fur. For a second, he thought he felt the dog lean into it. Just a little. The rest of the patrol passed in tense silence. When they returned, Sergeant George slapped Jack on the back. "Good work, Turner. You listened. Remember that." That night, Jack lay awake, replaying the moment over and over. Samson, silent and steady at his feet. The cold, the fear, the quick surge of relief. For the first time since he'd landed in France, Jack felt like maybe, just maybe, he belonged. He whispered into the dark, "Thanks, Samson." No answer. Just the gentle rise and fall of the dog's breathing, steady as a heartbeat, anchoring Jack to the here and now. Somewhere outside, the guns kept booming, but in that moment, in that muddy tent, Jack was safe. Because of a dog he barely knew, and that was only the beginning. It only took a few days for France to remind Jack Turner that war didn't care how ready you felt. The forest surrounding their camp was thick and dark, alive with secrets. Each morning, he awoke with dirt in his mouth, sweat freezing on his skin, and the low growl of distant guns rumbling through his bones. By now, Jack and Samson had settled into a fragile partnership. The other handlers called Samson the machine behind his back, never barking, never begging, just following orders with a cold, ruthless precision. Jack felt both proud and frustrated by it, unsure if the bond they shared was anything more than drilled obedience. On the fourth day, the squad got orders to sweep a patch of woods just beyond the old trench lines. Reports of enemy activity, maybe stragglers, maybe snipers. Nobody knew. The men were tense, rifles tight in their hands, faces drawn and pale. Jack walked point again, Samson padding ahead, every muscle coiled. The forest swallowed them, light dying fast under a tangled ceiling of leaves and shrapnel-torn branches. Jack felt sweat bead beneath his helmet. Every step was deliberate. Every sound, crack of a stick, flutter of a bird, made his heart slam against his ribs. Samson paused, nose twitching, body rigid. Jack raised his fist, signal to halt. The whole patrol froze. Jack crouched, whispering, "What is it, boy?" Samson's eyes flickered to the left, where a muddy slope vanished behind a copse of trees. Suddenly, crack, crack, crack. Gunfire erupted from the underbrush. The air split with the vicious whine of bullets. Men dropped for cover. Jack's body reacted before his mind could catch up. He dove behind a fallen log, dragging Samson by the leash. Shouts and curses echoed. Someone screamed, close. Jack's world shrank to the raw, animal fear coursing through his body. Then pain, sharp, electric, flared in his left thigh. He looked down, already knowing. Blood seeped through the fabric of his uniform, hot and sticky. The ground seemed to tilt beneath him. "Medic!" someone yelled. The gunfire kept coming. Jack tried to crawl, but his leg was useless. agony shooting up his side. He gasped, hands clutching at the mud. And then he felt weight. Heavy, warm, unmoving. Samson had thrown himself across Jack's body, shielding him from whatever might come next. Bullets thudded into the log, splintering bark inches from Jack's face. Samson didn't flinch. With shocking strength, the dog grabbed the strap of Jack's medic pouch in his teeth, tugged it free, and dropped it next to Jack's hand. Then, with his front paws, Samson tried to pull Jack further behind the log, dragging, insisting, refusing to let him be exposed. Jack's vision blurred from pain. "Samson, go! Get out of here!" The dog ignored him. Another burst of gunfire, this one closer. Jack saw something glint in the air, a piece of shrapnel slice across Samson's flank. The dog yelped, a sharp, broken sound, but didn't move away. He pressed himself tighter against Jack, baring his teeth at the world. For a moment, everything slowed. Jack's trembling fingers closed around Samson's fur, his lifeline in a world gone mad. The chaos around them faded, replaced by the steady thump of Samson's heart against his chest. Voices, American voices, shouted from behind. "Return fire!" The enemy retreated, the gunfire thinning, then gone. Someone crawled to their side, hands grabbing Jack, hauling him up. "You're hit! Jesus! Hang on!" Samson wouldn't let go, refusing to leave Jack's side. The medics tried to pull him away, but Samson snarled, muscles bunched, teeth bared. Only when Jack whispered, "It's okay, Samson, I'm here," did the dog let them work, never straying more than a foot from Jack's side. The rest of the squad gathered, faces streaked with sweat and grime. Sergeant George dropped to his knees beside Jack, eyes wide as he saw the blood. "That dog," he muttered, shaking his head. "I saw him cover you. Damnedest thing I ever seen." Samson licked at Jack's hand, ears pressed flat, his flank bleeding from the shrapnel wound. Jack's own pain faded, replaced by a swell of gratitude, and something deeper, wordless. He reached for Samson, pulling the dog close, burying his face in the thick, matted fur. The medics patched up Jack's leg as best they could, applying pressure and a quick bandage. They wrapped Samson's side too, hands gentle, voices low. Jack watched, dazed, as his blood mingled with Samson's on the dirty bandages. They were a mess, man and dog, wounded together, inseparable. When the squad finally limped back to camp, Jack had to be carried, but Samson walked on his own, head high, never leaving Jack's side. The other handlers watched in awe, wordless. No one dared call Samson the machine again. That night, Jack lay on his cot, leg throbbing, staring at the canvas above him. Samson curled at his feet, tail still, eyes never closing. Jack reached down, fingers threading through the dog's fur. "Why didn't you run?" he whispered, voice cracking. Samson's only answer was to nudge Jack's hand with his nose, warm breath tickling his palm. They both survived the ambush, but everything had changed. Samson was no longer just a dog the army had assigned him. He was something else now, a partner, a guardian. Jack's heart beat a little steadier with Samson beside him. He slept, finally, in fits and starts, waking each time with the same thought. He saved me. I'm alive because of him. Somewhere just before dawn, Jack made a promise, silent and unspoken. As long as he drew breath, he would never abandon this dog. The war outside raged on, but Jack and Samson, wounded, bloodied, and bound, had found each other in the chaos, and neither one would ever be the same. They called it the Deep Patrol, the one you didn't want to draw, the one nobody talked about. But orders were orders, and Jack Turner, leg only half-healed, marched through the biting dusk with Samson at his side. There was snow in the air, soft, drifting flakes that softened the edges of the ruined woods, turning barbed wire and cratered earth into ghost shapes. It was supposed to be routine. Check the old German line, watch for tripwires, and report back. But nothing was routine in this war, and Jack knew it. He kept a hand on Samson's harness, his only anchor in the dark. The other men behind him faded in and out of sight, muffled by snow and exhaustion. They'd been moving an hour when the world shattered. A sudden, violent roar, an explosion so close Jack felt the heat on his cheek. The ground buckled beneath his feet. He heard himself scream, a high, helpless sound lost in the chaos. Snow and dirt filled the air, blinding. Something hit his helmet. Hard. The sky spun and went black. When Jack opened his eyes, the world was sideways. He lay half-buried in a jagged crater, loose earth pressing against his ribs. Every part of him ached. There was ringing in his ears. He blinked, spitting grit from his mouth. For a moment, he thought he'd gone deaf. There was nothing but the dull throb of his own heartbeat. Then, movement. Warm fur against his side. Samson. The dog crawled from under a chunk of earth, shaking snow from his back. His ears flicked, alert, but there was a tremor in his body Jack hadn't seen before. Jack struggled to sit up and nearly blacked out. Pain stabbed through his head. Blood dripped warm across his forehead. "Samson," he croaked, voice barely above a whisper. The dog pressed close, nuzzling Jack's shoulder, as if to say, "I'm here." He looked around. The crater was deep, too deep to climb out easily, at least not without both legs working right. Night pressed in on them. Cold crept under Jack's collar, mean and insistent. No flares, no voices, just silence, except for the distant pop of artillery miles away. Jack tested his limbs. His left arm moved, shaky. Right leg throbbed but held. But when he tried to stand, the world lurched. He tumbled back, stomach churning, head spinning. Samson whined, a low, urgent sound. Jack tried to reassure him, but his voice failed. Snowflakes drifted down, cold as regret. Jack's fingers stiffened as he tried to dig through the loose earth. Futile. He was trapped. "Help!" he shouted, his breath rising in frantic white puffs. Nothing answered but the wind. The sky darkened, stars pricking through gaps in the clouds. Time turned strange, stretched and warped, measured only in shivers and the beat of his heart. His wounds ached, but worse was the cold, clawing deeper every minute. Jack felt his thoughts slowing, memory blurring. He tried to remember protocol, what to do if separated, how to signal, how to survive. Samson pressed close, his big body warm, his breath steaming in the night air. Jack wrapped his arms around the dog, fingers sinking into the thick fur. "Stay with me," he murmured, desperate. Samson answered by lying on top of him, shielding Jack from the wind. The weight was comforting, a reminder that he wasn't alone, not yet. Jack's mind began to drift. Images floated up, pulled from old corners of memory. He saw his father's hands, calloused, strong, teaching him to fish on the Jersey shore. He heard his mother's voice, gentle as she tucked him in at night. He remembered Lucky, the scruffy mutt he'd loved as a boy, licking his face after he fell from his bike. Each time his eyes closed, darkness grew heavier. He fought to stay awake, mumbling nonsense to Samson just to hear a voice, to remind himself he was still alive. But the cold was relentless. It crept into his bones, gnawed at the edges of thought. His fingers lost feeling. His lips grew thick and slow. Time ceased to mean anything. Was it minutes? Hours? He couldn't tell. The world was just snow, fur, and the soft thump of a loyal heart. As Jack faded, he heard something. A bark, faint and far away. Not Samson's, a high, boyish yelp. Memory twisted into dream. He saw himself, age 7, running through a sunlit field with Lucky racing beside him. He was warm, whole, fearless. Then the scene shifted. Bombs fell in slow motion. The sun vanished behind clouds of smoke. He reached for Lucky, but the dog was gone. He woke with a start. Samson was still there, his body trembling against Jack's. "Don't go," Jack tried to say, but the words slurred, sticky with exhaustion. The cold deepened. Jack's thoughts wandered to home, a battered porch, his mother's stew, the sound of the radio on a Sunday. For a moment, he forgot where he was, forgot the war, the pain. There was only the comfort of Samson's steady presence, the rise and fall of the dog's breath. Sometime in that endless night, Jack felt a warmth spreading from Samson, more than just body heat. It was something deeper, a lifeline, a promise, unspoken but understood. The dog shifted, licking Jack's cheek, keeping him tethered to the present. Above them, the snow fell heavier. Jack drifted in and out, half dreaming, half aware, caught between life and memory. Each time he faded, he felt Samson's weight anchor him, refusing to let him slip away. Dawn never really came, just a faint gray glow in the sky. Jack's body was numb, thoughts sluggish. He clung to consciousness by a thread. Samson's body was cold too, but the dog never left his side, not for a moment. When help finally arrived, distant voices, boots crunching in snow, Jack couldn't lift his head to call out. He felt arms lifting him, rough hands checking his pulse. Samson barked, sharp and fierce, refusing to leave until they pulled Jack out of the crater. As they carried him away, Jack glimpsed Samson limping beside the medic, his fur matted with ice and blood. He tried to thank him, but all that came out was a sigh. Later, drifting into unconsciousness, Jack understood. Samson hadn't just saved his life. He'd given him a reason to hold on, a heartbeat to anchor him through the longest, coldest night of the war. And for that, Jack would never, ever forget. Somewhere between night and morning, between the world of the living and the world of dreams, Jack drifted. He was dimly aware of pain, sharp, insistent in his head and leg, and the relentless cold that had wormed its way into his bones. He tried to open his eyes but found them weighted shut, lashes crusted with frost and blood. He heard distant voices, maybe medics, maybe just the wind, muddled and fading in and out. All the while, Samson's warmth pressed close against his chest, steady as the heartbeat Jack was afraid to count. Each exhale from the dog came with a cloud of mist, as if Samson alone could hold back the night. Jack's mind slipped free, tumbling into the deeper currents of memory. He was a child again, feet dangling from the back step of his parents' row house in Newark, New Jersey. It was summer then, so hot even the alley cats had gone silent. His father came home in uniform, boots dusty, smile tired but real. Jack ran to him, arms out, laughing as his father scooped him up. "You take care of your mom while I'm gone, Jackie boy?" his father would ask. Jack would nod, solemn as a judge. But war, Jack understood now, was a thing that stuck with you. It clung to the edges of his father's smile, to the silence at the dinner table, to the quick way he'd flinch at loud noises. "You ever scared over there?" Jack had once asked, late at night, his voice barely more than a whisper. His father had stared at the ceiling for a long time before answering. "Everyone's scared, kid. It's what you do with it that matters." The dream shifted. He saw his mother, hands dusted in flour, rolling out dough for bread. She leaned in close, her voice soft but firm. When you can't trust the world, Jack, trust something smaller, something that looks you in the eye. He'd never known exactly what she meant. Not until now. Lying in the cold, Samson's big head rising and falling with every breath, his mind moved on, flickering to Lucky, his childhood mutt, more bark than bite, always stealing socks and sleeping on his pillow. Jack remembered the sting of loss the day Lucky died, how empty his world felt, how long it took to get used to silence. Now, with his body half numb and his mind slipping, Jack realized he'd found that missing warmth again, only in the battered, loyal form of Samson. The thought stirred something in him, a fierce, protective love that reached deeper than the pain or the cold. The real world seeped in, then slipped away. He heard snatches of conversation, a flashlight's harsh glare flickering through the snow, someone's hand on his shoulder, a voice shouting his name, then fading to nothing. Jack tried to respond, but his throat was too dry, his lips too cracked. He was floating, half dreaming. He saw himself back in the woods, whole and strong, running beside Samson through endless green. Sometimes the forest turned to city streets, the sounds of war replaced by distant traffic, the soft ring of a bicycle bell. Always, Samson stayed at his side. A shadow, a guardian, a friend. At one point, the pain in his leg sharpened, bringing him closer to waking. He became aware of Samson's head resting on his chest, the dog's breath slow, even, exhausted. Jack summoned the last bit of strength he had, struggling to lift his hand and tangle his fingers in Samson's fur. "Don't leave me," he managed to whisper. "Not yet. Not now." Samson let out a low, rumbling sigh, a sound that felt almost human, full of fatigue and loyalty. The dog shifted his weight, pressing closer, as if promising with his body what words never could. The pain faded again. Jack drifted, caught in dreams that spun and twisted. He saw flashes of home, his mother waving from the porch, his father's battered old radio playing songs of hope and love. He felt the ache of all he'd left behind, all he was afraid he'd never see again. But always, the dreams circled back to Samson, his silent courage, the way he'd stood his ground under fire, the gentle weight of his head on Jack's chest. Time lost meaning. Jack didn't know if hours passed or just minutes. He felt hands lifting him, the world swinging wildly, snow and cold biting at his cheeks. But always, Samson was there. Someone tried to pull the dog away. He heard the struggle, the shouts, but Samson barked, snapping at the stranger, refusing to let Jack go. When Jack finally surfaced fully, blinking up at gray daylight, he found Samson still there, sprawled across his legs, head heavy on his chest. For a moment, Jack just watched him, feeling the slow, patient rhythm of Samson's breathing. He realized he owed this dog more than his life. He owed him his soul. In that quiet, broken dawn, Jack made a promise. It wasn't the sort of promise you said out loud or wrote in a letter home. It was deeper, etched in bone and blood, forged in the crucible of fear and loyalty. As long as he lived, Jack would never leave Samson behind, would never let the army take him, would fight for this dog with everything he had. Samson blinked, lifting his head. Jack managed a smile, a real one, cracked and battered but honest. "We're gonna make it," he whispered. "You and me, I promise." Samson wagged his tail once, just a little as if he understood. Outside, the guns were silent. For the first time in days, Jack felt a flicker of hope. Not because the war was over, but because he'd learned, when everything else falls away, sometimes all you need is something smaller, something that looks you in the eye. He closed his eyes, hand buried in Samson's fur. and let sleep finally take him, knowing he wasn't alone. Not anymore. Jack's consciousness flickered, slipping in and out like a broken radio signal. He felt pressure on his chest. Samson's weight, comforting and real. But every time he tried to fully surface, the world spun away into a gray, freezing mist. His breaths grew shallow, each one a ragged effort. The cold wasn't just outside now. It had crept into his bones, settling in the hollow places behind his ribs. Somewhere above, voices echoed, sometimes clear, sometimes muffled by snow and earth. He thought he heard someone calling, maybe his name, maybe just the wind howling across no man's land. For a moment, Jack wondered if this was it. The war, the memories, all of it dissolving into white. Samson, battered and limping, felt the shift. The dog's instincts screamed that time was running out. He pressed his nose to Jack's cheek, desperate for a sign, any movement, any flicker of recognition. Jack's eyes fluttered but didn't open. His lips were blue, breath shallow and rasping. Samson whined, a sharp, anxious sound that cut through the dawn. He circled once, nose low, then stopped, tense and trembling. He had never left Jack's side. Not through gunfire, not through the bitter cold, but something deeper than training surged through him now. It was something primal, a drive older than orders or commands. He needed help. Fast. With one last look at Jack, Samson scrambled up the steep side of the crater, claws scrabbling against icy mud. Each step sent pain through his shrapnel-wounded flank, but he forced himself on. When he reached the rim, he paused, chest heaving, ears up, listening. Far off, boots crunched on snow. The smell of men, familiar and strange, wafted through the air. Samson barked, a single explosive sound. Not the frantic barking of fear, but the urgent call of purpose. Then he ran, limping but determined, through the ragged underbrush and twisted trees, his breath steaming in the bitter morning. He followed the faintest scent trail, weaving between shattered trunks, ignoring the throbbing pain in his side. The world narrowed to sound and smell, the scent of gun oil, canvas, and something coppery, blood. Time slowed. The forest seemed endless, every shadow a threat, every broken branch a memory of the night before. Almost 2 miles from the crater, Samson found the patrol. 3 soldiers huddled near the edge of a clearing, boots caked in frost. One of them, Sergeant George, knelt beside a fallen tree, mapping their search route. The men looked up in shock as Samson crashed through the undergrowth, chest heaving, eyes wild. "Samson?" Sergeant George stared, disbelief flashing across his face. "What the hell? Where's Turner?" Samson barked again, voice hoarse but urgent. He bit down on the sergeant's coat sleeve, tugging, pulling with all the force his battered body could muster. When the sergeant tried to pull free, Samson refused to let go. He growled, a sound so fierce and desperate that the other soldiers flinched. "He's trying to tell us something," one man whispered. Sergeant George hesitated just a moment, then glanced at the others. "Follow him, go!" Samson took off, glancing over his shoulder to make sure the men were coming. He moved slower now, every step an agony. But he never wavered. The soldiers stumbled after him, slipping on ice, hearts pounding as the sun crept higher in the sky. After what felt like forever, Samson led them back to the crater. He reached the edge, barking furiously, circling until they saw what he saw. There, half buried in snow and mud, Jack Turner lay unmoving, his skin the color of old parchment, his breath little more than a whisper. "Jesus, move, medic!" Sergeant George dropped to his knees, sliding down into the crater. He checked Jack's pulse, relief flickering when he felt it. Faint, but still there. Samson whined, nose pressed to Jack's chest, as the medics worked fast, They wrapped Jack in every blanket they had, rubbing his arms and legs, forcing warmth back into his frozen limbs. They checked his leg wound, the gash on his forehead, whispering to each other in terse, urgent voices. "Come on, Turner. Stay with us," Sergeant George muttered, voice tight. Samson hovered, never more than a foot away, eyes locked on Jack's face. He nudged Jack's limp hand with his nose, licking his fingers as if to will him back to life. Finally, Jack stirred. His eyelids fluttered, breath catching as warmth trickled back into his veins. He tried to speak, but his lips were too numb. Samson whimpered, pressing closer, his tail thumping weakly in the snow. The soldiers lifted Jack gently onto a stretcher. Samson followed, refusing to be separated. The squad trudged back through the forest, moving slow and steady, the weight of the night heavy on every back. Hours later, they reached the field hospital. Jack was pale and shivering, but alive. Medics rushed him inside, peeling off frozen clothes, wrapping him in heated blankets. Samson hovered in the doorway, eyes never leaving Jack for an instant. Sergeant George stood beside the dog, hand resting on his battered head. "He saved Turner's life," the sergeant said quietly, voice thick with awe. "That dog, he's not just a soldier, he's family." Inside, as Jack faded in and out of sleep, he felt Samson's presence, warm, solid, and unyielding. He managed to whisper, voice raw and broken, "You came back." Samson pressed his head to Jack's chest, breath deep and slow. In that moment, surrounded by pain and fear and the smell of blood and disinfectant, Jack understood. Loyalty was more than a word. It was action. It was sacrifice. It was a wounded dog, battered and bleeding, limping miles through enemy woods because his person needed him. They'd survived the night. They'd survived the worst. And as the first rays of sunlight touched the frost outside, Jack made a silent vow. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, no matter what. Light filtered in pale and uncertain through the high tent windows of the military field hospital, painting everything in a watery haze. Jack's first conscious thought was that his bones ached, not just from cold, but from exhaustion so deep it felt like it had been hammered into him. His head pounded with every heartbeat. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was, only the scent of antiseptic, the groans of other wounded soldiers, and the soft shuffle of nurses' boots on canvas floors. He tried to move and gasped at the sharp jolt of pain radiating up his bandaged leg. His throat felt raw. He swallowed and tried to turn his head. And then he saw him. Samson was there, sprawled at the foot of the bed, body curled tight as if he could keep Jack safe by sheer proximity. His fur was dirty and matted, patched with bandages from his own wounds, but his eyes were open, watching Jack with fierce intensity. The moment Jack met his gaze, something in his chest loosened. He wasn't alone. He hadn't dreamed the night, the snow, the warmth of fur against his cheek. A nurse noticed Jack stirring and hurried over, voice gentle. "You're awake. Good. Welcome back." She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead and checked his bandages. "You're lucky, soldier. Another few hours in that cold, it would have been a different story." Jack's voice came out in a hoarse whisper. Is Samson okay?" The nurse smiled, glancing at the dog. "He wouldn't leave your side. Not even let the orderlies move him. He's stubborn as you are." She paused, her expression turning thoughtful. "He hasn't eaten much since you got here, though. Only nibbles. Seems like he's waiting for you." Jack reached a shaky hand toward the foot of the bed. Samson lifted his head, ears perking up, and then, unable to contain himself, crawled closer, laying his head gently on Jack's chest. Jack stroked his fur, feeling the dog's steady heartbeat. And for a moment, everything else, the war, the wounds, the fear, faded into the background. That night, when supper was served, Samson refused the bowl the nurse set in front of him. He only sniffed at it, nose wrinkling, then looked at Jack, tail giving a single uncertain wag. Jack understood. He asked for some leftover bread and pressed a bit into his own mouth, chewing slowly, making sure Samson could see. Only then did Samson eat, gulping down the food as if it finally meant something. The nurses shook their heads, whispering about the strange, silent bond between dog and soldier. Days blurred together as Jack recovered. Some wounds were easy to see, cuts, bruises, stitches running up his leg and over his brow. But the deeper wounds ran quiet, showing up in the way his hands sometimes shook, the way his mind drifted back to the crater and the cold. Samson stayed with him through all of it, only leaving Jack's side when forced outside for a brief run or when the doctors cleaned his wounds. The moment he returned, he'd curl up close again, like a living blanket. Other soldiers in the hospital watched them, sometimes with envy, sometimes with awe. Some joked, good-naturedly, about how Jack must have bribed the brass to let him keep a dog in the recovery ward. Others simply shook their heads, saying nothing, because some things didn't need words. One evening, a young corporal limped over on crutches and stopped beside Jack's bed. "That your dog?" he asked, nodding at Samson. Jack smiled, weak but real. "Not really. More like, I'm his person." The corporal grinned. "Looks like he'd follow you anywhere. Hell, if half the men here had a friend like that, maybe we'd all get through this in one piece." As Jack's body healed, the doctors came with questions about his memory, about the night in the crater, about whether he could walk again, whether he was fit for duty. Jack answered what he could, but he was always honest about one thing. He never would have survived if it wasn't for Samson. On the coldest nights, when pain kept Jack awake and the darkness pressed in too close, Samson would rest his head on Jack's chest, breath warm, eyes heavy with a kind of old, tired wisdom. There was no need for commands anymore, no hand signals, no shouted orders across muddy fields. Their bond had gone beyond training, beyond the logic of man and beast. It was something deeper, a trust built out of shared suffering, silent promises, and the kind of loyalty that simply refused to break. As Jack's strength returned, he was finally able to stand, to hobble around the ward with a crutch and Samson limping beside him. Nurses and doctors cheered. The other wounded called out encouragement, some reaching out to scratch Samson's ears. Through it all, Samson walked with quiet pride, head held high. One morning, the field hospital was shaken by a distant barrage. Jack stiffened, instinctively reaching for Samson, heart pounding. But Samson was there, calm and steady, anchoring Jack with a gentle nudge. The world outside could roar and rage, but inside that little circle, bed, man, dog, there was only peace. After weeks, the medics declared Jack well enough to leave the hospital. He walked out, still limping, with Samson at his side, heads held high against the uncertain future. Jack never forgot the lesson of that winter, that some bonds don't need words, and that sometimes the strongest kind of love is simply the act of staying, day after day, night after night, at the foot of someone's bed, refusing to leave. Spring came slowly to France, sneaking in on chilly breezes that carried the scent of mud and hope. The trees budded tentatively, and the sun hung longer in the sky each evening. By now, Jack had returned to his unit, limping but standing tall, with Samson ever faithful at his side. The story of how they survived the crater had rippled through the company, part rumor, part legend. Men who'd barely nodded at Jack before now stopped to clap him on the shoulder, or more often, to kneel and scratch Samson's ears. But the war didn't stop for legend. Patrols continued, sometimes easy, sometimes harrowing. Jack and Samson were assigned to security detail, then messenger runs, then back to the front again. With every mission, Jack trusted Samson more, not just with his life, but with his spirit. When the days were hardest, when the news from home was bad, when the stench of war seemed too much to bear, Samson was the constant, silent, patient, watching with eyes that missed nothing. Jack wrote home more often now, filling his letters not with stories of gunfire and death, but with tales of Samson's bravery and quirks. "Ma, you wouldn't believe this dog," he scribbled, cramming the words into the margins. "He'd fetch my helmet from under a jeep, then lie down on my foot like a heater when the nights got cold. He saved my hide, honest, like something out of those old hero stories Dad used to tell." One afternoon, as the company returned from a long, muddy patrol, the unit's commanding officer called Jack aside. Captain Brooks was a hard man, gray-haired and steely-eyed, known for being fair but rarely sentimental. He gestured at Samson, who stood at attention as if he understood the gravity of the moment. "I've been hearing about what your dog did, Turner," Brooks said. "You two saved each other. Hell of a thing." He paused, looking down at Samson. "We're putting in a nomination for a medal. Not for you, don't get a big head, but for him." Jack grinned, unable to help himself. "He deserves it, sir. More than I ever could." Brooks nodded. "Don't get too hopeful. The brass don't hand out medals to animals, not officially anyway." But the squad wouldn't be deterred. The men pooled together, gathering signatures and statements. They wrote up an account of what had happened in the woods, the mine, the ambush, the crater, the long night, and attached their own testimonies. Some men wrote simply, others waxed poetic, but every note carried the same message. Samson was more than a dog. He was a soldier, a comrade, a hero. The paperwork made its way up the chain of command, passed from desk to desk, stamped and initialed, and sometimes even read. Weeks passed. Each morning, Jack checked the mail roster, half expecting news, half knowing what the answer would be. One morning, a letter arrived. The official seal was broken. The words impersonal and cold. To Private Jack Turner, thank you for your submission. At this time, the U.S. Army does not decorate animals. While the actions of your K-9, Samson, are admirable, regulations do not permit the awarding of military honors to non-human personnel. Please extend our gratitude to your unit for their service. Jack stared at the letter for a long moment, jaw clenched. The other men gathered around, reading over his shoulder. Someone muttered a curse. Someone else spat in the dirt. "Typical," said Sergeant George, voice full of quiet fury. "If Samson had a rifle, maybe then they'd pin something to his chest." Jack looked down at his dog, sitting quietly in the shade of the mess tent. Samson gazed back, calm as ever, eyes reflecting a wisdom beyond his years. He didn't need a medal to know what he'd done, but Jack needed the world to know. That night, when most of the camp was asleep, Jack sat on his bunk, a single lamp burning overhead. He reached into his duffel and pulled out his spare set of dog tags. They were dented, worn from months of hard service, but the metal still shone in the lamplight. Jack pulled out his pocket knife and began to scratch, slowly, carefully, engraving Samson's name onto the blank back. Samson. When he was done, he hesitated. Then, below the name, he carved out a phrase. Words he'd heard in his own head 100 times. Words he wanted Samson to carry forever. He carried no gun, but he carried me. Jack threaded the chain through the new tag and reached for Samson, who had curled up at the foot of the bed, half dozing. The dog looked up, and Jack pressed the tag into the thick fur around his neck, fastening it beside the Army's issued ID. "There," Jack said softly, his voice thick. "You saved me, old boy. You did more than anyone ever asked." Samson licked his hand, tail thumping once. Word of Jack's homemade medal spread quickly. The next morning, soldiers nodded respectfully as Samson passed, the tag glinting in the sun. Some saluted, some smiled, some simply rested a hand on his head. No one said anything about the official letter. Nobody needed to. In the weeks that followed, Samson's tag became a quiet legend. Whenever a new recruit joined the unit, the old-timers would point to the German shepherd and say, "That's Samson. He saved a man's life, you know, carried him through hell and back." Jack knew there would never be a parade, never a ceremony. But sometimes, late at night, when the guns were silent and the world seemed at peace, he'd reach down, feel the tag cold beneath his fingers, and remember the silent, stubborn loyalty of the dog who had carried him farther than any medal ever could. Victory parades swept across Europe, banners unfurling in city squares, strangers embracing as news of Germany's surrender echoed through every battered street and hushed village. For Private Jack Turner, though, the end of the war felt quieter, almost fragile, like something you could scare away if you breathed too loudly. He stood at the edge of the army camp, clutching the discharge papers in one hand, Samson's leash in the other. The world had gone mad with celebration, but all Jack could do was look down at his battered, loyal friend, the old dog tag with Samson's name and those etched words swinging from his collar. He carried no gun, but he carried me. There was one final hurdle, getting Samson home. Army rules were strict. Military dogs, even heroes, were government property. Most were shipped home for reassignment, or worse, left behind to uncertain fates. But Jack, stubborn as ever, filed every petition he could. He went from officer to officer, retelling their story. When paperwork failed, he wrote to the Red Cross, begged for help, and called in every favor he was owed. Sometimes, in the quiet dark, he'd lean down and whisper, "I'm not leaving you, Samson. Not now. Not ever." Finally, after months of waiting, the day arrived. Jack held the stamped approval letter in his hands, heart pounding, unable to believe it until the officer himself clapped him on the back. "Take him home, Turner. You both earned it." And so, on a rain-slick May morning, Jack and Samson boarded a crowded troop ship bound for New York. Jack felt the weight of the ocean and the war behind him. But as long as Samson was there, head resting on his boots, tail thumping whenever Jack looked his way, he believed in tomorrow. The journey was long and loud. The lower decks smelled of sweat, seawater, and dreams of home. Some soldiers played cards, others penned shaky letters or stared out at the endless gray waves. But wherever Jack went, Samson followed. Even men who'd lost everything seemed to soften at the sight of the dog with the medal on his collar. Old, tough sergeants offered him scraps from their mess tins. Young privates asked if they could pet him for luck. Samson seemed to sense who needed comfort the most, leaning in, eyes calm and wise. The ship docked in New York on a foggy dawn that seemed made for homecomings. The harbor was alive, whistles blowing, mothers waving handkerchiefs, little kids clutching cardboard signs. Jack's hands shook as he stepped off the gangplank. Samson pressed to his leg. Somewhere a band played "When the Saints Go Marching In," the notes cracked but determined. He found his mother in the crowd, smaller and grayer than he remembered, but with the same fierce hug. She cried when she saw Samson, dropping to her knees to wrap her arms around the dog. Is this him? Is this your hero? She sobbed, tears soaking Samson's fur. Jack nodded, fighting his own tears as Samson licked her cheek, tail wagging so hard it smacked Jack's leg. Home wasn't a grand house or a wide street. It was a tiny place in the Catskills, shingled roof, creaky porch, wildflowers growing in the cracks of the path. Jack spent his savings to buy it, determined to build a new life out of the quiet. The neighbors were mostly veterans. Families who understood what it meant to come home changed. The first night, Jack built a fire in the little stone hearth. He cooked stew, badly, burning the bottom, and split the loaf of bread with Samson, who lounged on the rug, eyes following every movement. For the first time in years, Jack slept without fear, the old nightmares chased away by the soft weight of a dog curled at his feet. The days fell into gentle rhythm. Jack fixed the fence, cleared the garden, learned to mend the roof when summer storms rattled the shingles. Samson was his constant companion, trotting beside him as he walked the winding country roads, chasing squirrels, always too slow, dozing under the apple tree in the yard. Sometimes kids from the village would come to visit, always shy at first, until Samson licked their hands or let them toss a stick for him. On the last Monday of May, Jack woke before dawn. He put on his best shirt and the one tie he owned. He brushed Samson until his coat gleamed. Together they walked into town for Memorial Day, Jack with a small American flag in one hand, Samson's medal tag shining on his collar. The town square was full of veterans in uniforms gone tight at the waist, widows in black, and children waving flags. Jack stood at the edge, remembering friends who hadn't made it home, the long nights in France, the sound of rain on tin and distant guns. When the mayor called for a moment of silence, Jack knelt beside Samson, tying the flag to his collar, pressing the metal so it clinked softly. "Not for what you fought," Jack whispered, voice thick, "but who you saved." People noticed. After the ceremony, neighbors and strangers came up, asking about Samson. Some had heard the story, some hadn't, but everyone wanted to shake Jack's hand, to scratch Samson's ears, to say thank you. Summer melted into autumn, and Jack learned to live again. There were bad nights, when thunder reminded him of shellfire, when loss threatened to drown him. But every time Samson was there, sometimes with a gentle nudge, sometimes just his steady breathing in the dark. They had both been changed by the war, scarred, older, maybe even a little broken. But together, in a quiet house in the hills, Jack and Samson found a kind of peace, not the loud storybook ending of parades and medals, but the gentle comfort of trust, loyalty, and the knowledge that, no matter what, they had come home together. Years passed in the Catskills, each season settling gently over Jack Turner and Samson as they built a quiet, ordinary life together. Their days were simple: morning walks through dew-drenched fields, afternoons tinkering in the shed or chasing the shade under the old apple tree, evenings with the crackle of a radio and the warmth of a fire. The town knew them, man and dog, as inseparable as the river and the stones, the pair who walked everywhere side by side. But time has its own way of marching forward. Samson, once tireless, began to slow. His muzzle grayed, and his steps grew measured, careful, as if he was savoring every inch of the ground beneath his paws. Jack noticed it first in the little things: the way Samson lingered a moment longer before standing up, how he would pause at the foot of the porch steps, gathering his strength before climbing, how he slept deeper and longer each afternoon. But the old shepherd's eyes still shone with that same loyal light, the spark that had once stared down the darkness of war. Jack tried not to think about how old Samson was. Some nights when the wind rattled the windows and the world felt too quiet, he'd lay on the floor beside the dog, fingers twined in Samson's thick fur, telling stories. Sometimes about the war, sometimes about nothing at all, just the ordinary joys and sorrows of a shared life. Samson listened, as always, his breathing slow and steady, his presence a comfort deeper than words. One autumn morning, the hills around their little house burned gold and red with turning leaves. Jack called Samson for their usual walk, and the dog's tail wagged in answer, though his gait was stiff. They took their time, following the old trail down to the creek, stopping often so Samson could sniff every fallen branch, every scent on the breeze. Jack tossed a stick into the water, more out of habit than hope. Samson gave him a look, a tired, dignified refusal, then sat down at Jack's feet, head resting on his knee. Jack knelt and scratched behind Samson's ears. "We don't have to do that anymore, old boy," he said softly. "We can just sit." The seasons turned again. Winter brought deep snows and quiet. Jack would light a fire and read by lamplight while Samson dozed beside the stove, the flames reflected in his wise, patient eyes. Every night, before bed, Jack would kneel and clip the old metal tag, the one engraved with Samson's name and those words, to the dog's collar. It had become a ritual, a silent salute to battles fought and the bond they shared. Then one morning, as the snow began to melt and the first stubborn shoots of green poked through the thawing earth, Jack found Samson waiting at the bottom of the stairs, as always, ready for their morning watch on the porch. The dog's legs trembled slightly as he climbed the steps, but he made it, settling at Jack's feet as the sun crested the distant hills. The world was quiet, just the soft trill of a bird, the wind in the trees. Jack sipped his coffee, watching the sun warm the fields, and told Samson a story, a memory from long ago about a boy and his dog, about a battlefield in France, about fear and courage and the night the war almost took everything. Samson's ears flicked. He blinked slow and contented, every breath measured. Jack reached down, his fingers finding the metal tag. He held it up, letting the sunlight glint off the worn letters. "You can rest now, soldier," he whispered, his voice thick. "You did more than anyone ever asked, more than I could ever repay." Samson laid his head on Jack's boot, his breathing slow and peaceful. Jack kept talking, words tumbling out in a quiet murmur. Thanks, memories, promises. He spoke until the sun was high and the world was bright and green again. At some point, Jack realized Samson's chest had stopped rising. There was no struggle, no sound, just a gentle stillness, as if the old dog had slipped away with the morning light. Jack's heart clenched, but he didn't cry. Not right away. He just sat there, one hand on Samson's side, the other holding the old tag, feeling the weight of 1,000 memories. People from town came to pay their respects, neighbors who'd watched Jack and Samson for years, children who'd tossed sticks for the dog in summer, men who'd heard the stories of what Samson had done. They gathered on the porch as Jack dug a grave under the apple tree, his movements slow, deliberate. He laid Samson there, wrapped in Jack's old army blanket, the metal tag resting on his broad chest. That night, Jack sat alone on the porch, the house too quiet, the world too wide. He remembered every moment, the battlefield in France, the desperate nights in the hospital, the gentle years of peace. He whispered stories to the darkness, letting the memories flow, knowing they would echo long after the words faded. Sometimes Jack would wake in the night and imagine he heard the soft thud of Samson's paws on the floor, the gentle click of the metal against his collar. He missed the weight of that head on his knee, the warmth of that steady, silent presence. But grief, Jack learned, was just another kind of love, a love stretched across the years and the miles, a bond unbroken even by death. And in the quiet moments, as dawn crept in and birdsong filled the air, Jack knew that Samson's courage, his loyalty, his quiet watchfulness would never really leave him. He'd said goodbye to his best friend. But the story of Samson, the soldier without a gun, was far from over. As long as Jack lived, he would remember. Some heroes never need a medal. Some love stories never end. Decades blurred by, yet the memories of war and loyalty never dulled for Jack Turner. Now in his 80s, his hair white and hands lined with time, Jack lived alone in the same Catskills house, quieter than ever, but never truly lonely. The apple tree where Samson rested stood tall, sheltering each spring beneath its sturdy boughs, petals drifting like snow on the simple marker stone. Samson, a soldier's friend. Each morning, Jack would make his coffee, creak open the porch door, and sit with the sun on his face, Samson's old tag dangling from his key ring, thumb tracing the worn inscription out of habit. He carried no gun, but he carried me. Sometimes the only company was the birds and the hush of wind. But today, the porch held new laughter. Jack's grandson, little Eli, 7 years old and wild-hearted, sprawled on the steps with a battered toy Jeep, making engine noises as he bounced it over the porch boards. The boy's dog, a gangly golden retriever named Max, panted happily nearby, tail wagging. Jack watched the pair, a smile tugging at his weathered face. He saw echoes of himself and Samson, youth, trust, mischief, and love, all wrapped up in muddy paws and hopeful eyes. After lunch, as thunder rolled gently in the hills, Eli crawled up beside Jack. "Grandpa, can you tell me about Samson again? The war story?" Jack smiled, his voice thickening. He lifted the old dog tag from his key ring, let it swing in the sunlight. "You want the real story, or the one your mama says is too scary?" Eli grinned. "The real one. All of it." Jack settled back, the porch creaking beneath him. He began, voice slow, weaving the years together. "Well, Samson wasn't just a dog, Eli. He was my best friend. You know, back in the war, not all the soldiers carried guns. Some carried hope. Some carried each other." He told the story. The battlefield in France, the mud and the fear, the cold nights and desperate days. How Samson saved him from a landmine, from bullets, from the freezing dark. How that big German shepherd had shielded him, never running, never letting go. Eli's eyes grew wide at every twist, every moment of danger and triumph. "When I was scared, when I was lost, Samson found me. When I was hurt, he wouldn't leave. Even when he was hurt himself, he limped all the way back to camp to get help. He was braver than any man I knew." Jack's voice cracked. He reached down, rubbing Max's soft ears. He didn't need to talk, didn't need a medal. He just stayed. Eli was quiet, studying the old tag. "Did Samson really save your life, Grandpa?" Jack closed his eyes, the old ache and gratitude washing through him. "He saved what was left of me when the war tried to take it all." His hand shook a little as he pressed the tag into Eli's palm. "Not all heroes wear uniforms, kid. Not all loyalty can be given orders. Some lives are saved by love that doesn't flinch." Eli's voice was soft, awed. "Is that why you always put the flag on his grave on Memorial Day?" Jack nodded, feeling the sun warm his old bones. "Yes, not for what he fought, but for who he saved. Every year I remember him. I remember what it means to trust, to give everything, even when it's hard. Samson showed me that. He taught me about courage that doesn't need guns, about love that outlasts war." The storm passed. Sunlight slanted golden across the porch. Max nudged Eli, then curled up with his head in the boy's lap. Eli patted him, thoughtful. "Do you think Max could be a hero too?" Jack chuckled, voice hoarse. "Any heart that loves like that is a hero in my book." He rested a hand on Eli's shoulder. "Just promise me, if the world ever feels scary, you find something smaller you can trust. Something that'll look you in the eye and stay by your side." For a long while, they sat in companionable silence. 3 generations, man, boy, and dog, linked by memory and love. As twilight settled and the porch lamp flickered on, Eli looked up, searching Jack's face. "What happened after the war, Grandpa? Were you ever scared again?" Jack looked out at the old apple tree, the marker beneath its branches. "Oh, sure. Sometimes the world's scary no matter how old you get. But when I was afraid, I remembered Samson. I remembered how he'd lay his head on my chest, even when he was tired, just to keep me warm. That's real bravery, sticking by someone no matter what." His voice dropped, a hush falling over the porch. "I had a guardian, Eli, with 4 legs and more courage than any man I ever knew." Night pressed in, cool and gentle. The crickets began to sing. Jack squeezed his grandson's hand, and together they watched the stars come out, one by one, bright against the velvet dark. Reflection filled the quiet spaces between them. Not all heroes carry weapons. Not all loyalty is spoken. Some lives are saved not by orders, but by love that doesn't flinch. The old tag gleamed in Eli's hand, a small weight heavy with meaning. Jack leaned close, his voice a whisper, slow and reverent, as if passing down a sacred secret. "Remember, Eli, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just stay. Love with everything you have, and never, ever forget the ones who carried you." In the darkness, the bond remained, unbroken, undiminished, echoing through the years, the story of a boy and his dog, and the kind of courage that never dies.